What if the story you were told about an entire people was built on something that was never fully true? Not a rumor, not a misunderstanding. A scientific blind spot so large that it swallowed 130 million people whole and nobody noticed for centuries. If that question just made something move in your chest, stay right here. Because what you are about to hear is going to change the way you see Mexico, its people, their past, and maybe even yourself. Before we go any further, do something simple. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and share this with someone who deserves to know the truth. This is the kind of information that rarely makes it out of scientific journals and into real conversation. Let us change that today. Now, let us talk about a story, not a comfortable one, but an honest one. For a very long time, the world had a clean, simple explanation for who Mexican people are. The story went like this. Spanish soldiers arrived in the early 1500s. They conquered a powerful indigenous civilization. Over the following centuries, the two groups mixed together, and from that mixing came the modern Mexican, the mestizo, a blending of native and European blood with a small thread of African ancestry woven in from the colonial slave trade. That was the official version, the textbook version, the version printed in school curricula, repeated in history documentaries, and accepted without serious challenge for generations. It is not that the story was entirely wrong. It is that it was dangerously incomplete. And in science, a story that is incomplete but feels true is more dangerous than one that is obviously false. Because nobody goes looking for what they think they already understand, so nobody looked. Not carefully enough, not with the right tools, not at the right scale. Then modern genetics arrived, and everything changed. When researchers began applying large-scale DNA analysis to Mexican populations, they were not expecting to overturn anything. They were expecting to confirm what history had already told them. A mixture, a blend, something in the middle. What they found instead was a picture so layered and so surprising that it forced a complete rethinking of one of the most important population stories on the planet. Let us start with something called mitochondrial DNA. This is genetic material passed down almost exclusively through the maternal line, from mother to child, generation after generation, going back thousands of years. It is one of the most reliable tools scientists have for tracing ancient ancestry through the female side of a family tree. When researchers collected and analyzed mitochondrial DNA samples from over 2,000 individuals across Mexico, the result was not what anyone predicted. Nearly 90% of maternal lineages in the Mexican population traced back to 4 major Indigenous American haplogroups. These are genetic families that existed in the Americas long before any European ever set foot on this continent. Nearly 90%. Through the mothers, through the grandmothers, through an unbroken line of women stretching back thousands and thousands of years before any ship crossed the Atlantic. That single number shattered the balanced blend story. If the mestizo narrative were accurate, you would expect to see something closer to a 50-50 split, give or take. What scientists found instead was that the maternal gene pool of Mexico was overwhelmingly, almost entirely, indigenous in origin. The European contribution to that side of the genetic story was minimal, barely a trace, almost invisible against the ancient signal that had been present all along. But here is where it gets more complicated. Because genetics never tells just one story. The maternal line gives you one piece of the puzzle, the paternal line gives you another, and in Mexico those two pieces look nothing like each other. When scientists examined the Y-chromosome, which is passed exclusively from fathers to sons, the picture was almost the opposite. Paternal ancestry in Mexican mestizo populations came back roughly 65% European, about 31% Native American, and around 4% African. Let that sink in for a moment. Through the mothers, almost entirely indigenous. Through the fathers, predominantly European. Through the mothers, almost entirely indigenous. Through the fathers, predominantly European. 2 completely different ancestral histories, living simultaneously inside the same body, carried by the same person, expressed through 2 different channels of the same genome. This is not a blend. This is not a smooth mixture. This is the biological fingerprint of a collision. A collision between the same body, carried by the same person, expressed through 2 different channels of the same genome. This is not a blend. This is not a smooth mixture. This is the biological fingerprint of a collision between 2 worlds that met in one of the most asymmetric, brutal, and consequential encounters in human history. The colonial period did not just change Mexico's culture, its language, its religion, its political structure. It restructured the genetic makeup of an entire population in a way that is still visible, still measurable, 500 years later. What the data tells us is this. European men arrived in enormous numbers and had children with indigenous women on a scale that fundamentally skewed the paternal line. The colonial demographic structure was not a mutual exchange between equals. It was a power imbalance written directly into the chromosome. European Y chromosomes flooded into the population, indigenous maternal lineages held on, and the result was a people whose very DNA carries the architecture of conquest in one half and the memory of an ancient civilization in the other. That is not just history. That is biology, and biology does not forget. But we cannot stop there, because to truly understand where Mexican genetics come from, we have to go back much further than 1519. We have to go back tens of thousands of years. We have to go all the way back to a time before any of the great Mesoamerican civilizations existed, before the Aztec, before the Maya, before anyone had ever drawn a map of this part of the world. We have to go back to Siberia. During the last ice age, sea levels across the planet were dramatically lower than they are today. That meant there was a stretch of exposed land connecting what is now northeastern Russia to what is now Alaska, a land bridge scientists call Beringia. And across that frozen corridor, small groups of people, hunter-gatherers following animal herds, made their way from the Asian continent into a completely empty hemisphere. Now, they did not know they were making history. They were surviving, moving where the food moved, following the cold winds and the massive animals that roamed the Pleistocene landscape. But their journey seeded an entire world. Over thousands of years, their descendants spread southward across both American continents. Some settled in what would become Canada and the United States. Others kept moving into Mexico, into Central America, into South America, all the way to the southern tip of the continent. And as they spread, they diversified, adapting to different climates, different landscapes, different ecological pressures. Populations that had once been connected became isolated from each other, developing their own distinct genetic identities over thousands of years of separate evolution. The Y chromosome data from native Mexican populations confirmed this directly. The haplogroups found in indigenous Mexican DNA matched those of populations in northeastern Asia, particularly in south-central Siberia and Canada. The genetic fingerprints of the original migrants are still there, embedded in the chromosomes of millions of living people. It is molecular evidence of a journey that happened before writing existed, before agriculture existed, before any city had ever been built on this continent. Think about what that means. Every time a geneticist looks at the DNA of a person from Oaxaca or Chiapas or the Yucatan Peninsula, they are looking at a document written by people who crossed a frozen land bridge from Asia into an empty continent thousands of years ago. That document has been copied and passed down through hundreds of generations. And it is still legible. Pause on that for just a second, because that is extraordinary. Now, something happened in Mexico after those early migrations that remains one of the most fascinating and disturbing mysteries in the entire field of genetics, something that still does not have a clean answer. The Olmec. Archaeology places the first true civilization of Mesoamerica along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, beginning roughly in the second millennium before the Common Era. The Olmec were the earliest complex society in the region. They built large settlements, developed early forms of writing and calendar systems, created monumental stone sculptures, including the famous giant carved heads, and laid the cultural and intellectual groundwork for every major Mesoamerican civilization that came after them. The Maya, the people of Teotihuacan, the Aztec, all of them built in some way on what the Olmec started. And then, by around 400 BCE, the Olmec were gone. Their cities abandoned. Their civilization ended. But here is the part that keeps geneticists up at night. The Olmec have left almost no detectable genetic signature, no clear Y-chromosome echo, no traceable mitochondrial lineage that scientists can point to and say with confidence, this came from them. The people who founded Mesoamerican civilization essentially vanished from the genetic record. What does that mean? It means the deepest ancestral root of Mexican civilization is, for now, a biological mystery. Scientists can show you where they lived. They can show you the monuments they left behind, but they cannot tell you where their bloodlines went. Whether they were absorbed into other populations, whether disease or conflict erased their lineages, whether the tools we have simply are not sensitive enough yet to detect their trace, we do not know. That is not a footnote. That is a hole at the center of the story. And right about now, this would be a good moment to take a breath. Because everything we have covered so far, the maternal and paternal divide, the Siberian origins, the Olmec mystery, this is only the ancient layer. There is a modern layer underneath all of this that is arguably more urgent, more immediate, more dangerous in its current form. Before we get there, a quick moment. If this video is making you think differently about what you thought you knew, then it is doing exactly what it is supposed to do. Tap the like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of content matters. Share it with someone. Post it somewhere. Let this information travel. It deserves to. And now, the modern layer. One of the largest genetic studies ever conducted outside of Europe took place in Mexico City. Researchers sequenced the complete genomes of nearly 150,000 adults, 150,000 people. The scale of this study alone was remarkable. But what the data revealed was not just fascinating, it was medically alarming. The indigenous portions of the Mexican genome, the ancient segments inherited from ancestors who lived in the Americas for thousands of years before contact with Europe or Africa, showed something specific and concerning. Those segments contained higher concentrations of what scientists call homozygous loss-of-function variants. In plain language, that means genetic positions where a person inherits the same damaged copy of a gene from both parents, causing that gene to stop functioning entirely. This happens when a population has been geographically isolated for a long period of time. When people are not mixing with distant gene pools, certain genetic patterns become more common within that group. They get locked in. Some of those patterns are neutral, some are beneficial, and some carry vulnerabilities that only become apparent when the modern environment changes dramatically around them. The indigenous populations of the Americas evolved in near complete genetic isolation from the rest of the world for roughly 15,000 years. They developed their own immune systems, their own metabolic patterns, their own genetic architecture, shaped by the specific pressures of their specific environment. Then the colonial period arrived and shattered that isolation. And then the modern world arrived with its processed foods, its industrial chemicals, its sedentary lifestyles, its stress loads that human biology was never designed to absorb. The result is a set of disease patterns and health vulnerabilities in Mexican and Mexican-descended populations that are specific, measurable, and routinely misunderstood by a medical system that was built around European bodies. Here is the deeper problem. The genetic databases that power modern medicine are not balanced. The reference panels used for genetic risk assessment, for drug development, for pharmacogenomics, the science of how your specific genes affect how you respond to medications, these databases were built overwhelmingly from European genetic data. White European participants make up the vast majority of the genomes in the world's major genetic research databases, which means that when a doctor uses a genetic risk calculator to assess a Mexican patient's likelihood of developing heart disease or diabetes or certain cancers, the algorithm underlying that calculator was not trained on people who share that patient's genetic ancestry. It was trained on a completely different population. The tool is not calibrated for the biology it is being used to assess, and the patient sitting in that office has no idea. This is not a theoretical problem. It translates into real miscalculations, real misdiagnoses, real medication dosages that work differently in bodies whose metabolic pathways follow genetic rules that the drug developers never studied. And it affects not just 130 million people in Mexico, but the roughly 37 million people of Mexican descent living in the United States, plus millions more across Canada, Europe, and Latin America. The genetic homogeneity myth, the assumption that Mexicans are a relatively simple, predictable demographic category, is not just a social misunderstanding, it is a public health failure. And the scientists who study this have been saying so clearly and urgently for years. The mainstream has largely not listened. Now let us talk about geography. Because one of the most important things the data reveals is that Mexico is not genetically uniform, not even close. The national average for genetic composition across Mexico has been estimated at roughly 50 to 62% Indigenous American, 32 to 45% European, and about 4 to 6% African. But national averages can be deeply misleading. When you look at specific regions, the variation is extraordinary. In the southern and southeastern states, places like Oaxaca, Chiapas, and parts of the Yucatan Peninsula, indigenous ancestry often accounts for 70 to 90% of the genetic makeup of local populations. These are not predominantly mixed communities in the mestizo sense. They are communities whose genetic identity traces almost directly back to the ancient civilizations that occupied these lands for thousands of years before any European arrived. In these areas, the genetic continuity between the ancient past and the modern present is startlingly clear. In the northern and western parts of the country, the picture is different. European ancestry in those regions can range from 50 to 60%, reflecting the different patterns of Spanish settlement and migration that shaped different parts of the territory. The North had different colonial history, different patterns of indigenous displacement and population replacement, and different geographic exposure to migration from Europe and elsewhere. What this means is that within the borders of a single nation, you have populations whose genetic profiles are as divergent from each other as populations from entirely different continents can be. A person from the central highlands of Oaxaca and a person from the northern border city of Monterrey may both call themselves Mexican, may both carry a Mexican passport, may both speak Spanish, and may share deeply different underlying genetic histories. They are both Mexican. And they are genetically quite different from each other. Both things are true at the same time. The complexity is real. And any framework, political, medical, or social, that flattens them into a single uniform category is not just imprecise, it is wrong in ways that matter. And then there's the third root, the part of the Mexican genetic story that has been suppressed the longest, acknowledged the most reluctantly, and documented the least carefully: African ancestry in Mexico. During the colonial period, enslaved Africans were transported to New Spain in large numbers, particularly to coastal regions on both the Gulf and Pacific sides of the country. They worked in mines, on plantations, in households, in ports. They built significant parts of the colonial economy. They introduced agricultural practices, musical traditions, spiritual systems, and biological lineages that became woven permanently into the fabric of Mexican culture and genetics. But for most of Mexico's national history, these communities were officially invisible. The government did not count them in census data. Their history was not taught in schools. The concept of Afro-Mexican identity was not formally recognized in national law until 2019. For generations, the descendants of enslaved Africans in Mexico lived outside the official story of their own country. The DNA did not agree with that erasure. When genetic researchers analyzed populations in coastal communities in Guerrero and Veracruz, the African signal was unmistakable and significant. In some of these communities, African ancestry approaches or even exceeds 9%. These are not statistical traces. These are living communities with living ancestry connecting them directly to West Africa, to the Middle Passage, to survival across generations of brutality and erasure. Their biological story is now being documented in ways their historical story never was. The third root was always there. Science is simply now making it impossible to look away. And all of this, the ancient Siberian origins, the asymmetric colonial encounter, the regional variation, the invisible African lineages, ancient Siberian origins, the asymmetric colonial encounter, the regional variation, the invisible African lineages, everything we have discussed, comes together into one of the most remarkable immune system findings in modern genetics. At the MHC region, one of the most critical segments of the human genome for immune function, researchers found that Mexican populations carry an of the most remarkable immune system findings in modern genetics. At the MHC region, one of the most critical segments of the human genome for immune function, researchers found that Mexican populations carry an unusually high proportion of African ancestral variants compared to the rest of their genome. This particular genetic signal is described as one of the strongest known signs of natural selection ever documented in a human population. It is comparable in strength to the selection pressure that produced lactase persistence in Northern Europeans, the ability to digest milk in adulthood, and sickle cell trait in West African populations. What this means is that the specific mixture of Indigenous, European, and African immune genetics in Mexican populations, combined with the unique pathogen history of Mesoamerica through the colonial period and into the modern era, has produced an immune system profile that is genuinely unprecedented. It does not map cleanly onto any other large population on Earth. It is its own thing, a product of its own unique history. And it is almost completely absent from the global genetic databases that shape how medicine understands immunity, disease risk, and drug response. Now, before we go into the final and perhaps most important dimension of all this, one more moment. Because what we are discussing here is not just interesting, it is urgent. If you are still with me at this point in the video, you already know that. So do something with that feeling. Share this video right now, copy the link, send it to someone who needs to hear it, post it somewhere. It will reach people who have never thought about any of this. Because information that stays inside one room does not change anything. Information that travels does. Now, the ending. There is a detail in the genetic research that most people miss. Most people assume that indigenous ancestry in Mexico has been fading over time, gradually diluted by centuries of migration, mixing, urbanization, and globalization. The assumption is that modernization moves in one direction toward homogeneity, toward a flattening of genetic distinctiveness into some global average. The data does not support that assumption. Recent studies have found that younger samples of the Mexican population actually contain a stronger indigenous genetic signal compared to older samples. Indigenous ancestry is not disappearing. In many parts of Mexico, it is holding. In some measurements, it is even strengthening relative to other ancestry components. The genome of ancient Mesoamerica is proving more persistent, more durable, more stubbornly alive than anyone predicted. And this matters enormously, because the mitochondrial DNA lineages of the pre-Aztec civilizations did not die with those civilizations. DNA analysis has found that lineages connected to the ancient Maya have been detected, Lineages connected to the ancient Maya have been detected in the genetic profiles of indigenous peoples as far away as Chile and Argentina. Lineages connected to the people of Teotihuacan have been found in indigenous Arctic populations. The genetic legacy of ancient Mesoamerican civilization did not stay in Mexico. It traveled. It spread across the full length of 2 continents, and it persisted. The people of ancient Mexico were not just the inhabitants of a specific geographic region. In a very real and documented biological sense, they were the ancestral heartbeat of an entire hemisphere. And then disease arrived, and it nearly stopped that heartbeat permanently. When European colonizers first made sustained contact with the indigenous populations of the Americas, they unknowingly introduced pathogens that the people here had never encountered. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, diseases that had circulated in Europe and Asia long enough for those populations to develop partial resistance, diseases for which the Indigenous Americans had no immunity whatsoever. The death toll was catastrophic beyond comprehension. Conservative estimates suggest that between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of Mesoamerica died within roughly 100 years of first contact. Think about that range. Even at the low end, half of everyone who had been alive in these civilizations was gone within a single century. At the high end, 9 out of every 10 people, entire languages, entire knowledge systems, entire genetic lineages, lines of ancestry that had developed over 15,000 years of isolated evolution, gone. Not reduced, erased. This is what is meant when historians and geneticists talk about a demographic collapse. Not a gradual decline, a cliff, a near vertical drop in the existence of an entire branch of humanity. And the survivors rebuilt from a drastically smaller pool in a new world that was simultaneously demographic collapse. Not a gradual decline, a cliff, a near vertical drop in the existence of an entire branch of humanity. And the survivors rebuilt from a drastically smaller pool in a new world that was simultaneously their home and their prison. And the genetic consequences of that rebuilding are still written into the DNA of their descendants today. The Mexico City study identified specific patterns in the modern Mexican genome that are the direct biological signature of this collapse. Patterns of relatedness suggesting that many Mexicans today share ancestry from a much smaller founding population than the pre-contact world contained. Stretches of the genome where both copies of certain chromosomes are identical in ways that reflect descent from a severely bottlenecked population. The collapse is not just history, it is structural, it is encoded. It is there in the cells of living people who have no idea they are carrying this particular story inside them. This is what 500 years of history looks like when you read it in the genome, not as metaphor, as data. And here is what needs to be said directly, without softening it. The world's medical and research institutions have known for years that their genetic databases are biased, that they overrepresent European populations, that this creates systematic gaps in medical knowledge for everyone else, and change has been slow, painfully, consequentially slow. Studies like the Mexico City Genome Project, the large-scale mitochondrial surveys, the Y-chromosome analyses across indigenous Mexican communities, these are beginning to fill some of those gaps. They are building the reference panels and foundational data sets that future genetic medicine for Latino populations will depend on. But the gap between where the science is and where the policy is, between what the researchers know and what the hospitals are actually using, remains enormous. And in that gap, people get misdiagnosed. People get the wrong medication at the wrong dose. People get risk assessments that do not actually reflect their biology. And people die from diseases that might have been caught earlier or managed better if the tools had been built to see them. This is not a distant future problem. It is happening right now in clinics in Los Angeles and Chicago and Houston and Mexico City and Guadalajara today, this week. Mexican people were never who the simple story said they were. They were never a clean blend of 2 forces meeting in the middle. Who the simple story said they were. They were never a clean blend of 2 forces meeting in the middle. They were always something far more ancient, far more layered, far more biologically complex than any political category, any demographic box, any census checkbox could possibly contain. They carry the genetics of people who walked across a frozen land bridge from Asia into an empty hemisphere. They carry the memory of civilizations that built astronomical observatories and agricultural systems that still sustain the modern world. They carry the biological scar of a demographic catastrophe that nearly ended an entire branch of humanity. They carry the invisible lineages of African ancestors, whose existence was officially erased and whose contribution was denied for centuries. And they carry all of this simultaneously in every cell, in every strand of DNA, in every generation that has survived to this moment. The genetic science of Mexico is not just a story about Mexico. It is a story about what survives, about what persists when everything tries to erase it, about the way biology holds onto truth long after the official record has tried to let it go. The most important chapter of this story has not been written yet. What happens when the medical system finally builds tools calibrated for this complexity? What happens when the children and grandchildren of indigenous communities see their ancestry not erased in official data, but confirmed, documented, and scientifically honored? What happens when the full weight of this genetic reality enters the political conversation about who these people are and what they deserve? Nobody has those answers yet. The sciences deserve? Nobody has those answers yet. The science is ahead of the institutions. The biology is ahead of the politics. The truth is ahead of the narrative. But it is moving, and it cannot be stopped, because the genome does not negotiate. It does not compromise. It does not respond to political pressure or institutional inertia. It simply contains what it contains, and what it contains, it simply contains what it contains, and what it contains, in the DNA of 130 million people living in Mexico and tens of millions more living across the world, is one of the most extraordinary human stories ever told. It was always there. We are only now learning to read it. If this video gave you something real, something that shifted how you see this story, please leave a comment below. Tell me what surprised you most. Tell me what you are thinking. This conversation matters, and I want to hear from you. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is exactly the right time. There is more coming, and you do not want to miss it.